Areopagitica remains relevant in the age of information technology. Despite being written in the 17th century, John Milton's arguments in the text address fundamental issues related to freedom of speech, censorship, and the exchange of ideas, which continue to be pertinent in the modern era. The advent of information technology, especially the Internet, has introduced new dimensions to these issues, making Areopagitica's exploration of intellectual liberty, the marketplace of ideas, and the potential dangers of censorship highly applicable to contemporary discussions. In the age of information technology, concerns about the regulation of online content, the spread of misinformation, and the balance between free expression and responsible discourse echo the themes presented by Milton. The challenges posed by the vast and easily accessible digital landscape underscored the importance of revisiting Areopagitica to consider its insights and principles in the context of today's technological advancements. Written during the height of the initial English Civil War, Areopagitica, a speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England in 1644, remains a robust defense of free expression. While the mode of conveying beliefs and ideas has shifted from printing to digital media, the inquiries posed by Areopagitica regarding freedom of thought, speech, and specifically writing are more pressing than ever. John Milton, renowned for crafting an English epic, Paradise Lost in 1667, that rivaled and even surpassed classical works in Greek and Latin, also distinguished himself as a prose writer. This aspect of his legacy often takes a backseat to his poetic acclaim. Yet, in Areopagitica, Milton supplied Western liberalism with language that continues to define it. In the current moment of crisis within a liberal tradition, revisiting the principles that forged this tradition proves both enlightening and beneficial. As the United States openly contemplates a potential for civil war, both literally and metaphorically, delving into the origins of Milton's arguments amid the 17th century British and Irish Civil War provides valuable insights into the inherent tensions within liberalism. There is scant evidence that Milton's most renowned prose work significantly influenced the thinking of his peers. In 1647, a German reader suggested its translation into other languages to disseminate it in regions marked by tyranny. However, he found it somewhat overly satirical, urging a more moderate presentation of its arguments. The true impact of Areopagitica, its title referencing Isocrates' seventh oration to the Areopagus, the ancient council of Athens, manifested in later revolutions and different nations. Thomas Jefferson quoted it, and a French translation by the Comte de Mirabeau went through 4 editions between 1788 and 1792. Its eventual influence on British thought is evident in the echoes of its arguments and imagery in John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty from 1859, where Mill contends that freedom of expression is a prerequisite for a flourishing society. George Orwell's potent essay, The Prevention of Literature from 1946, contemplating the dual threats to intellectual liberty posed by totalitarianism and monopoly and bureaucracy, was occasioned by his disillusionment after attending a pen club meeting commemorating the tercentenary of Areopagitica's publication in 1921. Orwell viewed the absence of any quotes from the pamphlet being commemorated as an indication of his contemporaries' failure to uphold the ideals they purported to champion. The outbreak of civil war between Parliament and the royalist forces of Charles I in 1642 led to the abandonment of pre-publication licensing mechanisms in England, wherein each publication had to be approved by a committee of bishops. This resulted in a surge of publications in the early 1640s, many being polemical attacks on the opposing political side in the Civil War. In this period of innovation and revolution, the Westminster Assembly, primarily consisting of Puritan clerics, began discussing new forms of worship to replace the structures of the collapsed Church of England. It was within this atmosphere that Milton, aged 34, felt emboldened to publish proposals in 1643 for a reform of divorce laws, allowing husbands to separate from wives not only on grounds of non-consummation or adultery, but also unhappiness and incompatibility. Milton's advocacy for reform seemed to have a deeply personal motivation, as he had married Mary Powell in the early summer of 1642, but she left him after a little over a month to return to her family. Although they were ultimately reconciled in 1645, this experience likely fueled Milton's push for changes in divorce laws. The publication of his tract, The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, in 1643, which Milton released anonymously and without authorization, profoundly unsettled him. Puritan clergy condemned it as heretical, accusing it of promoting sexual libertinism. The tract was invoked in petitions to Parliament, urging the reinstatement of pre-publication licensing. In response to these efforts to revive pre-publication censorship, especially considering the scrutiny faced by his own work on divorce reform and other books charged with heresy, Milton published Areopagitica in November 1644, once again without obtaining a license. Milton's engagement with these issues was not abrupt and stemmed not solely from a sense of personal offense. He had pondered the stifling impact of censorship and state persecution on intellectual and literary accomplishments long before composing Areopagitica. Following his departure from Christ's College, Cambridge in 1632, he immersed himself in an extensive exploration of European history. His attention was particularly drawn to instances of literary censorship in Italy, a country he resided in and explored between 1638 and 1639. Notably, in 2014, researchers discovered Milton's annotated copy of 1544 edition of Giovanni Boccaccio's Vita di Dante from 1360, translated as Life of Dante, in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The annotations, dating from around 1637 to 1638, highlighted Boccaccio's account of the papal authorities burning Dante's political work on monarchy from 1313 as heretical. Milton was acutely aware that Boccaccio's narrative of this censorship of Dante had itself undergone censorship, with some editions lacking portions, and he meticulously marked the excised passages in his annotations. Essentially, Milton identified a dual censorship process imposed in different centuries on two Italian writers he deeply admired. Milton's fascination with censorship and the Catholic Church's index of prohibited books predating his composition of Areopagitica is also evident in his surviving commonplace book. Compiled mainly during the late 1630s and early 1640s, this manuscript notebook contained entries related to the prohibition of books, among other subjects. He consistently referred to the Historia del Concilio Tridentino, that is, History of the Council of Trent, a critical work by the Venetian scholar and statesman Paolo Sarpi on the Council of Trent, convened by the Catholic Church from 1545 to 1563 for counter-reformation policies. Due to its potential to incite controversy, Sarpi's critique was clandestinely transported out of Venice and initially published under a pseudonym in London in 1619. In his first major polemical prose work, Of Reformation, from 1641, Milton mentioned Padre Paolo, the great Venetian antagonist of the Pope, cautioning that the same clerical usurpation of political power depicted by Sarpi in Counter-Reformation Italy had occurred in England under the bishops of the Church of England during Charles I's reign. During Milton's European tour in 1638 to 1639, he engaged with two prominent intellectual figures: the Dutch polymath Hugo Grotius, residing in Paris due to his theological views, and Galileo, who had been under house arrest in Florence since 1633 for his heliocentric beliefs. The encounter with Galileo holds significance in Areopagitica, where Milton cautions the Parliament that adopting measures such as a licensing order could instill fear and servility in England, akin to what had transpired in Italy and the Index, hindering genuine intellectual and literary accomplishments. In his words, "I have sat among their learned men, for that honour I had, and been counted happy to be born in such a place of philosophic freedom as they supposed England was, while themselves did nothing but bemoan the servile condition into which learning amongst them was brought; that this was it which had damped the glory of Italian wits; that nothing had been there written now these many years but flattery and fustian. There it was that I found and visited the famous Galileo, grown old, a prisoner to the Inquisition, for thinking in astronomy otherwise than the Franciscan and Dominican licensers thought. by referencing the philosophic freedom perceived to be lost by his Italian associates, which they inaccurately believed to be preserved in England. Milton translates into English the Latin phrase libertas philosophandi. This phrase, seemingly coined by Tommaso Campanella in his Apologia pro Galileo, Defense of Galileo, in 1622, argued for the necessity of the freedom of philosophizing in Christian nations. Campanella may have echoed Galileo, who in various writings quoted the dictum attributed to the Platonic philosopher Alcinous: "The philosopher needs to think like a free-born man." In this context, philosophy encompasses natural philosophy, or what we now term science, and the modern concept of academic freedom traces its roots to this 17th century notion of philosophic freedom. The vivid portrayal of suppressed books as martyrs to the truth, a captivating opening in Areopagitica, serves as the groundwork for Milton's recurring accusation that the English Parliament mimics the Inquisition in imposing tyrannical pre-publication censorship. While some may argue that such martyrdom imagery aligns solely with religious truth concerns, suggesting no broader implications for intellectual liberty and free speech, Milton counters this perception, although he contextualizes his arguments within a struggle to articulate religious truth against persecution by clerical elites. Linking it to the history of the Reformation, Milton uses historical instances of religious persecution to illustrate how censorship and the pursuit of heresy have stifled intellectual efforts across different times and countries. Under conditions of intellectual enslavement, enduring value cannot be cultivated. In a 1642 polemic against the Episcopal Church of England, Milton had already proclaimed that the impertinent yoke of prelacy, with its inquisitorial and tyrannical oversight, hinders the flourishing of free and splendid wit, preventing him from realizing his ambition to write an epic poem in English that rivals the achievements of Homer and Virgil. An often overlooked but radical move in Areopagitica is Milton's redefinition of heresy, reverting the term to its Greek proairesis etymological root. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, uses proairesis to denote the intellectual process of distinguishing and choosing between good and bad. Departing from the Augustinian concept of heresy as forbidden and requiring eradication from Christian belief, Milton embraces the pagan understanding of rational choice as an exercise in virtue. Milton asserts that reason is synonymous with choosing, and genuine knowledge emerges from a rational engagement with diverse opinions and arguments, regardless of their potential danger. Facing a continuous trial of virtue and making choices between good and evil in books and ideas aligns with the fundamental tenets of the Christian life. In Paradise Lost, Milton delves deeply into the origin of human existence as a trial of virtue. Milton also drew upon ancient Greek values to emphasize the significance of speaking truth to power. The title page of Areopagitica features a motto from Euripides' tragedy The Suppliants, which Milton both quotes in Greek and translates. True liberty prevails when free-born men in public council speak their minds with freedom. He who can and will deserves high praise, while those who can't or won't should hold their peace. What can be fairer in a state than this? These lines evoke the Athenian concept of parrhesia, a type of free and bold speech typically expressed by a distinguished citizen addressing a public assembly on a controversial topic. Milton presents himself as a parrhesiastes, driven by his love of liberty to publicly criticize Parliament at some risk to his safety. However, Milton did not conceive of free speech in the manner most Western societies do today, or at least have over the past 2 centuries, as a right secured by law and protected in the courts. Reading Milton anachronistically overlooks the fact that for him, as for the great Renaissance humanists, free speech primarily represents the exercise of virtuous character, not a right enshrined in law. By speaking freely, an individual showcases their possession of moral virtue, and their freedom to speak reflects the virtuous nature of the society they inhabit. Milton argues not for legal rights but against legislation that hinders and prohibits freedom of speech, at least until it is determined after publication that a book promotes ideas so impious or evil, absolutely either against faith or manners, no law can possibly permit them. In that case, the fire and the executioner will be the timeliest and most effectual remedy. In other words, heretical ideas should be published and judgment should follow. If found wanting, punishment is appropriate. However, ideas should not be censored before they are aired, a practice Milton likens to a kind of intellectual stillbirth. The issue of the brain should be no more stifled than the issue of the womb. This qualification raises the question of who determines the harmful effects of a text after its publication. These lines are often cited to highlight the sharp limits or elitism of Miltonic liberty and its perceived departure from modern liberal conceptions of free speech as a fundamental legal right. The belief that books can be suppressed after publication if they are found impious or evil partly stems from Milton's notion of virtue as the exercise of reason in choosing between good and evil. Truth, according to Milton, emerges through a dialectical process of sifting good from evil, a form of intellectual combat. In his words, whoever knew truth put the verse in a free and open encounter. Here, Milton's arguments most clearly anticipate the concept of the marketplace of ideas associated with John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty and often invoked in debates about the freedom of the press in liberal democracies, an idea likely directly influenced by Milton's pamphlet. One aspect of Milton's arguments against pre-publication licensing insists that Parliament's reintroduction of licensing was influenced by lobbying from the company of stationers, whom he accused of seeking to maintain a commercial monopoly on the print trade. His imagery of truth sometimes continues this commercial theme as he shifts the charge of monopoly from economy to intellectual and religious contexts. Allowing any interest group to control the circulation of ideas, similar to a company seeking to control the market for profit, will lead to the overall intellectual and spiritual impoverishment of a society. Despite the apparent similarities between the liberal idea of an unrestricted and deregulated marketplace of ideas and Milton's call for an absence of legislation, allowing readers to discern the good and true while rejecting the false and evil, Milton strongly emphasized that once bad books were identified, they should be suppressed. He was equally adamant that those advocating intolerance should be denied the freedom to do so. He says, I do not mean tolerated popery and open superstition, which as it extirpates all religions and civil supremacies should be extirpated itself, provided that all charitable and compassionate means be used to win and regain the weak and the misled. The second part of the statement, stressing the importance of charity and persuasion, is often overlooked when quoting the first part to argue that Milton was fundamentally a religious bigot. Critics may contend that his ideas about free speech and intellectual liberty offer little insight into contemporary liberalism. Nevertheless, Milton remains ambiguous about whether he implies that pre-publication censorship is permissible in cases where individuals aim to structurally repress free speech by completely eradicating other forms of belief and government. The question of whether we should tolerate those exploiting freedom of speech to promote violence, illegality, and intolerance is more pressing today than ever, especially concerning hate speech or religious extremism. Writing amid a devastating civil war, Milton argued that societies can nurture intellectual liberty only by somehow restraining those who would deny it. In its passionately eloquent exploration of challenges still haunting liberalism, the arguments presented in Areopagitica remain relevant in the age of information technology.